Okay, hello, good afternoon. Very pleased today to be welcoming Professor Fenton, and he's been doing a lot of work on the COVID statistics. Particularly the subject we wanted to look at today was the evidence about all-cause mortality. And by way of introduction, Professor Fenton is Professor of Risk Information Management at Queen Mary College London, if I've got that right. And has a training in maths and a specialization in quantifying uncertainty. And I guess, well, it's the Bayesian maths is your specialization, if I've got that right.
Yeah, Bayesian probabilistic causal reasoning, actually, yeah.
And I think you've been a pioneer in bringing that methodology into the sort of legal field in using statistics and Bayesian logic and maths in court cases and in the legal process.
Yep.
And
yep.
I have also, you're author of 7 books and 300 refereed papers. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, so yeah, and in fact, because so much of the COVID narrative from the beginning was driven by statistics and risk assessment, I and some of my colleagues were active from the start of the crisis in analysing publicly available data. And initially what we were doing and getting published were analyses such as more accurate predictions of infection fatality rates. And that work wasn't considered in any way controversial because it didn't sort of seriously challenge any of the, what I call the sort of the official narrative at the time. But it became clear to us that when the large-scale PCR testing started in the summer of 2020, especially testing of asymptomatic people, there was a really fundamental flaw in the data that was driving the narrative. And when we started to analyze the impact of this, our work suddenly became sort of shunned by mainstream academia and media. Now, the flaw was that a COVID case was simply defined as a person testing positive, irrespective of whether that person ever developed the disease symptoms. And most asymptomatic positives turn out to be false positives. And that means that any data based on the notion of a COVID case was massively compromised. And this also applies to hospitalizations and deaths attributed to COVID. So, for example, a COVID death, as most people now realize, I think, is defined just as a person who dies, for whatever reason, within 28 days of a positive test. But this flaw also applies to the data on vaccine effectiveness. Because in general, these data compare the number of positive PCR tests of vaccinated versus unvaccinated people. And these results are further compromised by the fact that in most of the observational studies, unvaccinated people are tested differently and more frequently than vaccinated, and so are more likely to result in false positives. Now, it's for this reason that we believe that in fact, if you can bring up we've got a chart on the summary data on all-cause mortality.
Yeah.
It's for this reason that we believe the only truly objective way to evaluate the overall risk benefit of the vaccines is to compare all-cause mortality for vaccinated against unvaccinated. Because if COVID is as dangerous as is claimed, and if the vaccine is as effective as claimed, we should by now have seen many more COVID-related deaths among the unvaccinated than the vaccinated. And this applies, what I'm saying, in each age group. And on the other hand, if the vaccine is as safe as claimed, there should have been very few more deaths from causes unrelated to COVID among the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. So the count of all-cause deaths should be higher among the unvaccinated than the vaccinated, confirming the benefits of vaccination outweigh the risks. And counting all-cause deaths completely bypasses this problem of defining what constitutes a COVID case or a COVID-related death, because those definitions, as we've seen, can be easily manipulated to fit different narratives. Mm-hmm. So we define a person as vaccinated if they've received at least 1 dose. And as we're not interested in whether a person becomes a COVID case, any other definition is kind of flawed because it will fail to acknowledge the adverse reactions, including death from vaccines, often occur shortly after vaccination.
So just to sort of sum up, the all cause should be lower because it's a sort of, in theory, it's a net effect. So you get a net benefit for the vaccinated of reducing the COVID deaths. And if there is any increase in mortality associated with vaccination, that all cause number will combine those two effects into one sort of metric, and that metric should be lower than it is for the unvaccinated.
Exactly. It's exactly right. And it's the simplest, most objective metric for that cost benefit trade-off.
Yeah. And I think also, as we'll go in a little bit, it's also the number, as you said, that ultimately is the one you can measure, because a death is a very definitive outcome, and there isn't the bickering between COVID, non-COVID, related, with, of, etc., etc. So, okay.
Yeah, exactly. And incidentally, the reason also that I think it's important to simply differentiate between someone who's, we're not interested in between partial and full dose. We want to know in terms of that mortality, because as it turns out that there is an issue with sort of high mortality rates in people who are partially vaccinated. We're simply interested in comparing whether, partially or fully vaccinated against the unvaccinated. So we'd ideally like to combine the different categories of vaccinated into simply whether they've had at least one dose of the vaccine. Because if they, it's important because actually some agencies actually count a person as unvaccinated if they die within 14 days of the second dose or after just one dose. And now that might make sense if we're only interested in the vaccine's ability to stop infection, but in the context of death attribution, that doesn't make sense at all. So in this table, if you look at this table then, which was from what we wrote, this was based on the week 26 of the government's vaccine surveillance report for that week. The Office for National Statistics cites 6,956 deaths in total. So I'm just looking at the data here. And incidentally, there were just 109 deaths classified as COVID-19 that week. So that's less than 1.6% of the total number of all-cause deaths. Now, if you look at this data, what you can see is it's really, really strange on so many levels. So the unadjusted mortality rate, that is simply the number of deaths per 100,000 people. So we just divide that total all-cause death number by the population size and multiply by 100,000. In contrast, the age standardized mortality rate, this ASMR measure, that's a metric to adjust for the different age distributions among the different groups. Now, the large differences, both within and between these two metrics, seem highly counterintuitive. And while some of the differences have an obvious explanation, others don't. So, for example, look at the unvaccinated group that has the lowest unadjusted mortality rate, which is 5 times lower than the rate for people with 2 doses, in fact. But the 2-dose vaccinated group actually has a lower age standardized metric. Now, that reversal is mainly explained by the fact that most deaths occur in the older age categories, which are also the categories with the highest percentage of double vaccinated people. So that's a known kind of like statistical quirk. But the age standardized mortality rate of the 1 dose, the partially vaccinated, is 10 times higher than the equivalent of the unadjusted rate for that group. So it's gone from 8.99 to 89.3. And that's really hard to explain, especially because over the last 10 years, the average overall age standardized metric for all-cause deaths for week 26 of a year is around about 18. So you can see you would expect them all not to be vastly different in that last column from 18, but they're all very different, right? You've got this massively higher partially dosed death rate. You've got the unvaccinated significantly higher. Why should they be significantly higher for all-cause deaths? This is not, remember, COVID deaths play an insignificant role in this, whereas the two-dose deaths is really so much lower. And actually, if you think about it, if these data are correct, if this age standardized mortality calculations are correct, then it seems that the first dose is somehow, it's kind of like, in relative terms, it's kind of like really sort of deadly, while the second dose is some kind of miracle treatment that helps people avoid deaths from all diseases. So it's kind of like weird. And on the next slide.
So I just want to just trying to sort of, because I think this is important basically, because for regular people, what we always see in all of the charts that they do, we see the data for the unvaccinated and the data for double dosed, and quite often just double dosed after 14 days. And that whole chunk in the middle is missing. Exactly. And I think what you're saying in this case, obviously deaths is very important, because if you have to go through the partially vaccinated zone, as it were, where before you get to fully vaccinated, and in that zone, your mortality rate's shooting up, then in a way, the lower numbers at the fully vaccinated level is partially a reflection of the fact that everyone's been ill in the partially vaccinated stage, and you can't ignore it. And I think this is the big question. And I mean, I'm just going to try and say a few words about age standardized, because it is a difficult concept. So if I just sort of summarize roughly, I think what you're saying is, in the 2 doses, because it's an old age group, it's kind of normal to have a crude rate, which is this 25, and that goes down because you're trying to translate what would 25 per 100,000 look like if that wasn't mainly older people, but it's just a regular population of people, and therefore that number goes down. And that makes sense, because I don't know what the average age is in the UK, but if it's sort of a median of 40 something, then when you translate that to sort of population, then you'd expect that age standardized level to go down, and that's sort of intuitively obvious. But the other changes are not obvious at all, and as you said, they're sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah, and one point, because you mentioned this about the difference between whether it's 2 doses or whether it's within 14 days of second dose. That 2 dose row here is actually people after the 14 days. So the single dose actually includes people who have been double dosed, but haven't got to the 14 days. Yeah. So it's hiding even more. It's hiding even more.
And we'll come into this, but we know that 14 days is really, a lot goes on in that 14 days, right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Now the thing is that, so if you go, so we've got this, on this next slide here, that's just a summary of exactly those age standardized. This is just coming straight from the document. It's those age standardized all-cause mortality rates for the 3 different. Yeah. You got the one. This isn't the. This is the one.
This is 3.
You've got the 3 there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you can see that those very, very big variations. You also see some really very, very strange trends here. Look at the increasing how it shot up, how it shoots up for those partially vaccinated as well. So that's all, it's all a bit bizarre. But now the thing is, we aren't interested in separating the different categories of vaccinated, right? We want to group them. We would just consider, in terms of for all cause mortality, we want to combine them into the category of vaccinated. They're either, they're vaccinated in some way, and look at the combined mortality rate. Now, obviously, the unadjusted combined mortality rate is actually much higher in the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. You can just see that from that previous table. Yeah. But we want to go by this. We want to use this age standardized, try and get this age standardized measure, even if we don't like it, because that's what's the one which is generally used for these comparisons. Now, the problem is the reports never provide the combined age standardized measure for the vaccinated. So we've got to infer that using a weighted average. And our key conclusion is on the next slide. You've got this, this is where you get the straight comparison between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And you can see that currently this metric for the vaccinated is currently running a bit higher than the unvaccinated. Now, it's critical to note that the Office for National Statistics did not provide the raw age categorized data. So this is just an estimate of what their measure would be if they had actually reported it. In fact, if we'd had that age categorized data, and this is a really critical point, we would simply be able to compare for each age category the all-cause mortality rate for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And that would make this unnecessary complex age standardized metric completely redundant, because it would allow us to just do the direct comparisons that we see. And incidentally, the good news is that the ONS have told us in direct communications that release of that age categorized data is planned for future versions of the reports.
Okay, good. So just to wrap up on this one, I mean, what you did was you took those two extremely diverse numbers for the partially vaccinated, which had an extraordinarily sort of high age standardized mortality, and the two dose, which was low, and you've sort of combined them into one figure, and you sort of comparing then unvaccinated, which is the blue bars, with one single number for vaccinated, which is made up of that table we looked at before, where they're sort of all over the place, those two indicators.
And it takes account of the fact that in the data there were more double dose than partially dose, which is why it's
the weighting is more towards the lower number.
The weighting has to favor the double dose, which was lower, but even taking that into account, you can see that it's overall there currently isn't much of a difference between the vaccinated and unvaccinated, but if anything, it seems to be slightly higher in the vaccinated group.
And then going back right to the beginning, the thesis was that orange bar should be lower than the blue bar, because
exactly, it should be the other way around.
So I mean,
now, especially by now, you'd have thought that at this stage, with so many people, double vaccinated, you should have been seeing that effect by now.
So we could sort of kick around a couple of possibilities, I guess. One is that COVID at this population level is sort of not. I mean, you said it's 1.6%, so maybe that could be one thing, that it's just showing that COVID itself on its own is not particularly deadly at this point in time. Therefore, the bars are more or less identical. I mean, that could be one thing. Or the other one is it is very dangerous, but there's been a net trade-off between reducing the COVID side and maybe creating some risk in the non-COVID side.
Yeah. I mean, there are also other there are other confounding factors. I mean, the increase in the general, there might be more all-cause deaths for other reasons, like the impact of lockdowns or whatever, or people not, as we know, people, late diagnosis and all that stuff. And that might affect the vaccinated and the unvaccinated differently as well. So we simply don't know. We don't know those kinds of things.
But I guess the only thing we can say, without being too critical, I guess, is that the thesis doesn't pan out in these numbers sort of from week 20 onwards. They're essentially, well, they're very similar, as you said, slightly higher in the vaccinated, but there isn't the expected outcome of reduction in all-cause mortality for the vaccinated. And I just wanted to ask a little bit about I think you said also in your paper, the blue all-cause rate is a little bit more intuitive, that it's higher in winter in those early weeks, sort of 1 to 5. You'd expect it to be up and then going down into summer, but you've got the reverse pattern.
Exactly.
That also is a bit of a mystery, I guess.
Exactly. It's strange. I mean, and also interestingly enough, I think you can actually also see even the two dose, which started off incredibly low, has actually been slightly increasing towards the summer months.
Yeah, in the individual categories.
Yeah. So but yeah.
Good. Well, let's go maybe a little bit more into this story a little bit, and go into the sort of data a bit further. So I guess this is the slide with the assumptions
Yeah.
on all impacts of the vaccine, covering everything basically: infection, symptomatic disease, hospitalization, and mortality. So there is an assumption that at least on the mortality side, there is a very significant impact from vaccination.
But remember, this is only referring to COVID death. This is only referring to COVID infections. It's only referring to COVID hospitalizations and COVID mortality. Now, there are some problems with these claims. As I say, the first, apart from the symptomatic disease one, these are all based on, as I said, this flawed notion of a COVID case. So these mortality rates here simply refer to people who died within 28 days of a positive PCR test. So it's not counting all-cause deaths. And as we've seen, it's the all-cause deaths which are massively dwarf the COVID deaths. COVID deaths almost, let's say 1.6 in the week we looked at it. And secondly, the unvaccinated actually includes all the partially vaccinated people.
Mm-hmm.
So it also, I said it doesn't include the non-COVID deaths. Now, the other thing is there's this massive issue of how to count or estimate the number of unvaccinated and vaccinated people. So this brings us on to this issue of the sort of the data limitations.
Yeah. Well, should we look at we did say we'd look at the case, what's actually was the outcome on the case numbers. So as an example of one of the assumptions, so there is an assumption here about a reduction in the case numbers post-vaccination, and sort of leaving aside the definite limitations on the positive PCR test. I think we put in this one table, which is the most recent one, about where we actually are on case numbers per 100,000 on vaccinated versus unvaccinated. So
we're not. So I'm not sure then which one will. Okay. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, you're quite right. Sorry, I'm now looking at it. Yeah. So so if you look at this this data, then, so bearing in mind it's got all of the problems I've said about this is all about case data, and that's not something that I'm particularly keen on. But what you can actually see here is that the government's own, so this is the government's own data here, is showing that in every age category after the age of 30, the rate for the vaccinated is actually higher than the unvaccinated. So that kind of like contradicts the effectiveness data that we've seen that's been claimed in other studies. And this is, I mean, it turns out that when this, so I'm just kind of like looking at, it's, if this was, I mean, this is really curious. Now, it turns out that when this came out last week, eminent statisticians like Professor David Spiegelhalter actually said this is nonsense, right? He called it misinformation. I don't know. He says this is nonsense because this relies on. I'm just looking at this. Relies on the so-called NIMS database, which is the National Immunization Management Service, to estimate the total number of vaccinated and unvaccinated. Whereas he says that, if you use the Office for National Statistics data, you'd get a different result. Now, so it turns out, this is a real problem. It turns out that the government, we found this in our most recent report as well, the government are relying on different conflicting sources of data relating to these numbers of vaccinated and unvaccinated. And those differences are very large, and they could massively impact the conclusions like these, because the denominators in all of the rate calculations actually rely on those being accurate. Now, the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, they use a cohort based on people who responded to the 2011 census and were registered with a GP in 2019 to remove potential immigrants, and it only covers about 80% of the population aged 10 plus. And that's why at least 10 million of the population in England is missing in the data we looked at earlier. And incidentally, there's also over 1,200 recorded deaths for week 26 that were missing because of that extra missing 10 million people. Now, in contrast, the Public Health England, who published this data, I say they use that NIMS data for the estimate. So these two data sets both have different but massive biases. They're massively biased, right? And they're not easily reconcilable. And the problem is that none of the assumptions about either data set are transparent. So there's a lot of guesswork going into our estimate of the combined age standardized mortality rate for the vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so that's what you can see here. And as I say, this is what caused a lot of controversy on social media following, you know, say Spiegel would have jumped into this, but it's not obvious. You know, why should you know? But this is from the government. These are all coming from government sources. You know, nobody's. It's just so strange. And who's to say which of these two data sets is the more biased data set?
Yeah, I will get into that second data set, but I think even on this one, yeah, there is a difference between the ONS population. Just for the sort of average person, I think that the issue is that the unvaccinated, by definition, is the total population minus the vaccinated.
Exactly.
And if everybody agrees on the number of vaccinated, it's the total population that's different between NIMS and ONS, and therefore that gives you different size of unvaccinated because that's implied from the total population.
Exactly.
But I think that's quite interesting discussion. But I think for the, you know, just now is that the point of this, you know, even if you adjust for the ONS population size or the NIMS size, you're not getting to a point where you're seeing much lower incidence of COVID in the vaccinated, and therefore that assumption we looked at in the previous table is not panning out in this data. I mean, you know, we can argue the toss over the population size, but roughly speaking, the COVID incidence is identical, more or less, between the groups. There is no clear sort of, there's nothing of the level of effectiveness that was in the assumptions, at least.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. Yeah.
So I think then exactly on flicking to the data set that you used, this is the link for anyone that wants to look at it, but it was essentially looks like a one-off. I think it's a one-off, where I haven't seen them do a weekly or a monthly. It was sort of a data set to the 2nd of July, which had those problems that you mentioned, that the total size of the population doesn't match up really to anything. As you said, it's 10 million short of, I guess, any population estimate, and it has a lot less deaths in it than the ONS.
The ONS, although they don't always make this clear. I mean, we had discussions directly with the ONS about this, and it wasn't clear to me until they'd explained to us how this was based, the way that it was based on this subset of the population coming from the 2011 census, and also having to be registered with a GP. So it just, to me, that suggests that actually a lot of the 10 million, a vast majority of the 10 million missing actually probably aren't vaccinated.
Yeah, okay. So we don't know, but you've written a very, very clear paper, which is linked at the end, which goes through in meticulous detail the sort of unexplained differences. And we understand this is a subset of the population, and you've all reconciled every data item from what we're seeing in this table to what the total population is, and you've identified the difference, and that's something hopefully ONS are going to fill in at some point in the future, basically.
Yeah.
But that would create a bias maybe in those all-cause mortality figures. We're not quite sure which way that could go. It may, as you said, basically be more sort of unvaccinated people, and therefore it may not impact the all-cause mortality in the vaccinated, or We just
no, but it wouldn't in the vaccinated, but it would actually lower the
lower in the
and
unvaccinated.
and if you think about it, if you remember when the unvaccinated rate was compared for the previous years, just looking at whether you actually for this you didn't even need to, not much difference between the age adjusted or the unadjusted. I'm saying previous years it's somewhere around about for that week in July, be expecting to see about 18 per 100,000 deaths, but it was actually it was something like 24 or 25.
Yeah, 25.
And therefore that doesn't make, that already suggests that the denominator basically wasn't the denominator, the number of unvaccinated was being underestimated, which is what we're almost certain that that's the case.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So, I mean, I think we can sort of round off a bit, because I think for the people that want to really dive into the detail, it is there. I mean, it's obviously a lot of work has gone into all of your papers on this, and it's in more or less excruciating detail what those issues were with the data. So that it's there for people that want to look at it. And I thought we'd just sort of round up a bit by looking, I guess, at a sense check, which is the chart of total death. Again, again, with your focus on all-cause mortality, this is one of the only definitive numbers that avoids, again, all those arguments, COVID with or for or because or involving or whatever it is. This is the total deaths in England and Wales, and you can see this 2021 is higher for those weeks than 2020, which again isn't that another sense check of?
It is, because that difference kind of like matches what we estimated for the age adjusted mortality between the difference, where you had that that small increase in the vaccinated compared with the unvaccinated. So that it kind of almost it is a good kind of like check, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the big question is, I guess, it's all about it's the impact on the thing that needs to be really discussed is this impact on all-cause mortality of the partially vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be where, if there are, where that might be the explanation. It's possible that could be the explanation.
Yeah, and as I said, it's always seems to be the case that they just airbrush that period between unvaccinated and fully vaccinated, 14 days. It just disappears in a lot of the, at least in a lot of the charts. I mean, it's in the tables.
It disappears, or it's moved into the wrong category. All kinds of things can happen. Yeah.
Okay. But as you said, this is a number that you can't really adjust in any way, and it's higher now than it was a year ago, and that maybe points to the data you had, which is showing that this is above the sort of long-term average, for at least for the unvaccinated, right? The 25 versus 18 kind of number.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing is then that this so it doesn't really therefore support the hypothesis, which is the one we're trying to test, with that the vaccine reduces the number of deaths, and as you say, that this really can't be fiddled. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that was really the just coming back to the conclusion before sort of opening up. The hypothesis is essentially not confirmed by the all-cause mortality comparison between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, look, all the caveats about the limitations of the data and what we don't know about the data have to be taken into consideration here. But with perfectly reasonable assumptions based on what is publicly available, it's difficult, it's difficult to conclude that the vaccine, is actually reducing all-cause mortality, which is, as I said earlier, that is the simplest and most effective measure of risk benefit.
Yeah. I mean, just throwing one other thing into the mix, I guess we discussed a bit, that is also the outcome from the trials when they did the 6-month follow-up from the actual vaccine trials. The all-cause mortality was identical. So there's quite a few pointers all going in the same direction.
Yeah, in fact, there's some of the trials data suggesting it might be again slightly higher in the vaccinated group.
Yeah, yeah. Good. So I think that's been very useful, and I just wanted to sort of, a couple of broader questions, I guess. Generally, I mean, your specialism is, having incomplete data and then using human intelligence to try and work out what the risks are. Generally, what would you say about where we are now? Because I mean, from my perspective, it feels a bit like an oil tanker in a lot of these things that we're doing. We just sort of plow ahead, and maybe the data coming in doesn't seem to be feeding into any kind of flexibility in policy. And I think vaccination has been one of those things where it's getting more and more compulsory, I guess, and there sort of seems to be less and less flexibility about looking at this kind of data and asking questions.
Yeah, I mean, for a start, it it'd be nice if the different government agencies could provide more transparency of the data used, as well as the raw data we've asked for, so that we can at the very least validate the claims that they make, or identify the reasons for the differences and errors.
Have you felt that the work that you've done, which is, I think, making quite a big contribution on this question, has that landed anywhere in any policy circles are you involved in?
It's had some impact. I mean, we did a Bayesian analysis of the meta-analyses that have been done, for example, on the effectiveness of ivermectin as an early treatment in potentially reducing COVID cases and deaths, and that work was cited in the ruling for the state of Nebraska to allow clinicians to prescribe ivermectin. So it's had some effect there, but generally, as I kind of intimated at the beginning, because most of the stuff that we're doing sort of challenges the accepted narrative, not only are we not getting the stuff published in sort of mainstream scientific journals, it's been consistently rejected there, but I've also been viciously attacked on social media by so-called media analysts and other academics, and also others who they actually call it fraudulent misinformation, even though it relies only on the government's own data. And many of those people are actually demanding that I be censored and sacked from my university position.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a fair kind of debate, basically, right? So
yeah,
it's kind of worrying.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the data is the data. I mean, yes, there's the uncertainties, and shooting the messenger is not going to really achieve anything.
Yeah. So, but we'll carry on, because I think it's, I mean, given the impact, especially with discussions about mandating vaccines and potentially more lockdowns. And of course, that's a separate issue, that the issue of, has there ever been a proper risk-benefit analysis done of lockdowns? And there certainly hasn't. There's no real evidence that those actually work. Proper sense of this data, and not just accepting an easily manipulated narrative especially based on these kind of like flawed PCR tests.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Well, I've also included here a complete list of links to all of the underlying material, both your work and the sort of ONS PHE raw data. So, as you said, it's all there. It's all official data. You've explained, where you've had to make assumptions, but the actual data is directly from ONS and PHE. There's nothing that's been sort of assumed on the actual underlying raw data. It's all official. So
yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that. I hope people find that interesting. It is a slightly complicated subject with these translations into age standardized mortality, but as I said, it's all clearly explained in the papers. So if there's further interest, then you should click on any of these links. And hope this has been informative, and please subscribe and like this video if you've enjoyed the content. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Fenton. That's very useful. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.